The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 8. Horrified, Johnny looked at Fergie. Fergie was staring down at the rifle and the flashlight, still breathing hard from the long run. Abruptly, he stopped to pick up the flashlight. He flipped it over to Johnny, who was so surprised that he almost dropped it. "Here," said Fergie. "Now we've each got one. Come on, let's get headed back to camp." Johnny was flabbergasted. He stood there opening and shutting his mouth. Finally, he managed to speak. "You mean you're gonna just..." Fergie hesitated. For a second he stared off into the darkness, and there was fear in his eyes, and he laughed harshly. His lips curled into a cynical and knowing smile. "Yeah," he said, "we're gonna mosey on back and get some sleepy by, if we can. Look, John, baby, don't you see what happened? He dropped his stuff here in the road, then he yelled bloody murder for a couple of minutes, and then he lit out into the woods. He's probably out there right now laughing at us. You didn't believe all that junk about a monster that turns people into mummies, did you?" Johnny was silent. Up until now, he had not believed the strange young man's stories, but he was beginning to have second thoughts. Johnny looked down at the chrome-plated flashlight he held in his hands. It looked expensive, and there was the rifle laying there, too. "Maybe you're right," he said slowly, "but, well, would he really have left this stuff just lying here?" "Why not? He's as rich as Croesus. He can buy himself more rifles and flashlights, can't he? Besides, he's got a screw loose. Crazy people do crazy things." Again, Johnny was silent. It seemed to him that Fergie was being very reasonable and logical. All the same, he had his doubts. Finally, with a weary shrug, he said, Okay, let's go back." "Right," said Fergie, nodding. Then, on a sudden impulse, he tucked his flashlight under his armpit, cupped his hands to his mouth. "Nighty-night, Chad, baby," he yelled. There was no answer, but then the boys didn't expect one. Fergie and Johnny did not try to take the rifle back with them. They left it lying on the rain-soaked road and slogged on back to camp. At the flagpole they parted, and each one ran back to his own building. As he slipped in, closing the door softly behind him, Johnny noticed the clock in the downstairs hall. It said 5 minutes before 2. Johnny didn't get much sleep that night. He was still terribly keyed up, and he lay tossing and turning for a long time, until around 5 a.m. He dozed off and had a dream about Mr. Glomus chasing him through an endless tunnel, and then before he knew it, reveille was blowing again, and Johnny crawled out of bed to face another day. When he came stumbling into the dining hall for breakfast, Johnny felt like one of the walking dead. For 2 straight nights he had gone without much sleep, and now it was beginning to get to him. He shuffled along the cafeteria line, sliding his tray over the stainless steel bars. As he was staring blearily at the bins of scrambled eggs, he heard the women behind the counter talking to each other. "Hey, Edna," said one, "did you hear that thing on the radio about that guy that got lost last night?" "No, I didn't. So what happened?" "Well, it was the same like all the others. He just disappeared. They found his gun lying in the road out near the old mansion. You know the one I mean. And then they found his car parked up the road with the keys in it. I bet you they never find him. Remember old Mrs. Spotfoot and Charlie Holmes and that bum? What was his name anyway? They never found none of them, and I bet they never will either." Johnny was wide awake now. He stared so hard at the woman who was telling the story that she noticed him suddenly clammed up. "Milk or Kool-Aid?" she asked in a toneless voice as she shoved a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon at Johnny. Mechanically, Johnny took a glass of milk and moved on down the line with his tray. His brain was racing madly. So it hadn't been just a tall tale. Chad really had disappeared, and there were others who had gone before him. Distractedly, Johnny looked this way and that. There was Fergie waving and motioning for him to come and sit down. Scuttling sideways, Johnny made his way down the narrow aisle between 2 rows of tables. He put his tray down, climbed into a seat, and immediately began talking. "Guess what?" he said breathlessly. "I just listened to those 2 women up there at the counter, and they claim that the guy we met really has disappeared, and there's others who've been missing too." Fergie looked at Johnny scornfully. Come on, Dixon. Those 2 old bags would believe anything they heard." "You mean you don't think?" Fergie laughed and shook his head vigorously. "Nah, I don't think. Really, Dixon, you're one of the most superstitious kids I ever met in my life. Look, that guy was crazy, right? He was playing a joke, and then maybe he screwed up and he really did get lost. And you want to know what else I think? I think he's the one that left that weird picture in the car for you. It'd be just like him. He's really out of his jug, so don't worry about him. He'll turn up one way or the other." "Uh-huh," said Johnny weakly. He was not convinced by what Fergie had said. but he didn't feel like arguing. He remembered the awful, agonized screams they had heard. Johnny felt sorry for Chad. He had really kind of liked him. And then, suddenly it occurred to him that they shouldn't be talking about last night's escapade at all. What if some creepy kid like Eckelbecker heard them and turned them in? Anxiously, Johnny shot a glance at the kid who was sitting across the table, but he did not seem to be paying any attention to Johnny and Fergie. His eyes were on his plate, and he was busy stuffing scrambled eggs into his mouth. Fergie elbowed Johnny in the side. "Don't worry about him," he said, snickering. "His ears are full of strawberries and jam." At this, Eckelbecker did look up. Days passed. Johnny learned Indian lore and made a belt out of little interlocking pieces of leather. With the other boys, he hiked for miles and miles, and on Saturday he got to climb Mount Chakora. It was a long, exhausting climb, and near the top it got scary because the path skirted the edge of a drop-off, but Johnny made it to the top like everyone else, and it gave him a great sense of accomplishment. He had done something courageous and difficult that he wouldn't have been able to do a week or a month ago. At the last fireside folk sing on Saturday night, Johnny stood proudly with the other scouts as they sang, "Softly falls the light of day, as our campfire fades away. Silently each scout should ask, have I done my daily task? Have I kept my honor bright? Can I guiltless rest tonight? Have I done and have I dared everything to be prepared?" Johnny felt the warmth of the fire on his face, and he felt friendly toward the other boys around him. He was sad about leaving, but he would be glad to see Grandma and find out how she was doing. Then he thought about Chad Glomus. He had never been found. For days, search parties had been combing the wooded areas around Mount Chakora, but he had not turned up. Johnny wondered if he should come forward and tell about what he and Fergie had seen, but to do that, Johnny would have had to admit that he had been out in the woods running around after taps, and he was scared of getting into trouble. And there was something else on Johnny's mind, too. It was the whole business of the Glomus will and the baffling collection of clues on the table. Johnny was absolutely convinced that he had figured out the first part of the puzzle, and that the will was out in the estate called Staunton Harold. But beyond that point, he was stuck, and come Sunday he was going to be even more stuck because he'd be back in Dunstan Heights, and the secret hiding place of the Glomus will would be far, far away from him. Even if he ever solved the riddle of the sign from the tea shop, he would probably never get a chance to test his theories or collect that lovely $10,000 reward. Sunday arrived, and Johnny packed up his things, shook hands with Mr. Brentlinger, and said goodbye. Then he climbed aboard the big black and yellow bus with all the other scouts. He was really sorry that he had to go, and as the bus pulled away from camp, there were tears in Johnny's eyes. But on the ride back, he had a good time. He got a seat with Fergie, and the two of them really talked up a storm. For the first time, Johnny discovered that Fergie lived in Dunstan Heights. The two of them had never met because Fergie lived over on the other side of town, and he went to public school. Johnny wondered at first why Fergie had been so close-mouthed about where he lived, but it gradually dawned on him that Fergie was poor. He and his family lived on the third floor of a triple-decker apartment house set down near the railroad tracks, and Fergie's father sold mail-order shoes and encyclopedias for a living. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the bus pulled into the parking lot next to the town hall in Dunstan Heights. When Johnny got out, he had his pack and his sleeping bag strapped on his back and his cardboard suitcase in his hand. He looked this way and that, and then he saw the professor and Grandpa standing next to the professor's old mud-spattered Ford. Although Grandpa was wearing his usual gray suit and gray wash pants, the professor was all done up in his blue pinstripe suit, and with the vest and the Phi Beta Kappa key that dangled from his gold watch chain. They were both smiling and waving at Johnny, but as he waved back, it suddenly struck him that their smiles were forced. There was something in their eyes that said, "Johnny, we have bad news for you." With fear clutching at his heart, Johnny wondered if the bad news had something to do with Grandma. And that is the end of Chapter 8.